All right, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we're going to be looking into, frankly, a really disturbing case, Samuel Little. And, we've gotten so much material on this guy.
Yeah, yeah. And for good reason. I mean, the sheer scale of it is,
Oh my gosh,
yeah,
yeah. It's hard to even comprehend.
it's really tough. So while he was convicted of 8 murders, Little actually confessed to 93. And the FBI has corroborated at least 60 of those confessions.
Wow.
So that makes him, based on confirmed victims, the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. It's really hard to even wrap your head around that.
It's just a staggering number. And it's not just the number of victims, but the time frame, too, right? I mean, we're talking confirmed crimes between 1970 and 2005, but there's a possibility that it goes even further back, maybe even as early as 1960, and maybe as late as 2012. So we're talking about decades.
Decades.
Yeah.
Decades where he was just moving around the country, basically, leaving this trail of victims. He was convicted in California, Texas, and Ohio, but the accusations spanned 16 other states. So it's not like this was a localized thing.
Yeah.
It was really nationwide.
Yeah. And one of the things that really, sort of gets you when you start to dig into this is he actually drew sketches of 26 of his victims,
Yeah.
which is it's just such a chilling element to this whole thing.
So creepy. And it's been really helpful, actually, because the FBI has released those sketches to try to identify some of the victims.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And some of them have remained nameless for decades.
It's a stark reminder of the sheer scale of the tragedy.
Yeah.
So for this deep dive, what we really want to do is try to, for you guys listening, we want to make sure that we kind of navigate this really complex and disturbing case and understand sort of all the key elements, right? Like his background, how did the crimes unfold, how was he caught, what are these confessions all about, what were the victims like, but also not get lost in the, sheer volume of information.
Right.
It can get really overwhelming.
It can.
So let's start with his early life. Who was Samuel Little?
So he was born Samuel McDowell, that was his original name, in 1940 in Georgia.
Hmm.
And his early life, I mean, it was pretty unstable. His mother was super young, and it's believed that she might have been involved in sex work and may have even given birth to him while she was incarcerated.
Wow.
Yeah. So shortly after he was born, the family moved to Ohio, and he was mainly raised by his grandmother.
So that's a really challenging start.
Yeah.
And were there any signs of trouble when he was younger, like in school and things like that?
Yeah. So he had some disciplinary issues when he was in junior high, and kind of looking back on it, with what we know now, it's pretty disturbing that he admitted to having these like sexual fantasies about strangulation from a really young age.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And as a teenager, he would actually collect these true crime magazines that depicted the choking of women. It's really eerie.
Yeah, it's a pretty chilling precursor to what ended up happening later. So when did he first start getting in trouble with the law?
Well, his first conviction was back in 1956 for breaking and entering, and this was in Nebraska. And that resulted in him being sent to a juvenile facility. It's interesting, like on his booking card, they actually listed his mother's location as unknown. Yeah. So in the late 1960s, he moved to Florida to live with his mother. And he started holding various jobs. Some of them were pretty strange, actually. Like he worked in a cemetery and as an ambulance attendant. At least that's according to him.
I mean, that's interesting, right? There's
Yeah.
already like a theme emerging there.
It's like he was drawn to these like darker aspects of life.
Yeah, exactly. And were these just minor offenses? Like, was this just sort of the beginning of his encounters with law enforcement?
Well, I mean, minor is kind of a relative term, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this is kind of the beginning. But it's important to note that he actually admitted to being arrested in 8 states for a whole bunch of different offenses. DUI, fraud, shoplifting, solicitation, even armed robbery, aggravated assault, and rape. And on top of all of that, he actually took up boxing while he was incarcerated.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he would call himself a former prize fighter.
Mm.
It's like he was pretty proud of that. But I mean, all of this taken together, you can see that this pattern of increasingly serious and violent behavior, it was there long before the confirmed murders.
Right. It's like a very clear escalation.
Yep, exactly. You can really see a trajectory forming.
Yeah. So when did he serve his first actual prison sentence?
So that came in 1961. He was convicted of breaking into a furniture store. And then by 1975, his arrest record had grown to 26 arrests across 11 states.
Wow.
And those arrests included things like theft, assault, attempted rape. There were even attacks on government officials.
Oh, wow.
This long and disturbing rap sheet. It makes you wonder, if there had been some kind of intervention earlier on, could it have prevented what happened later?
Yeah, it's a really tough question, right?
Yeah.
Like, were there missed opportunities to stop him?
Right.
So were there any murders that he was suspected of early on?
Yeah. So in 1982, he was actually arrested in Mississippi for the murder of a woman named Melinda Rose LaPree. She had disappeared in September of that year. But the grand jury actually chose not to indict him. And then, while he was under investigation for LaPree's disappearance, he was extradited to Florida to stand trial for the murder of Patricia Ann Mount.
Wow.
Yeah. And her body had been found in September of 1982. And there were actually witnesses who placed little with Mount the night before she vanished.
So, I mean, that seems like a pretty strong connection.
It does. But he wasn't actually convicted in that case.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He was acquitted in January 1984. And it seems like the acquittal came down to like a lack of trust in the witness testimonies. So it shows how difficult it was for law enforcement, even when they had a suspect and some evidence.
Yeah. So essentially, he walked away from being implicated in 2 murders within a couple of years.
He did.
Wow. So what happened after that acquittal?
So after that, he moved to California,
Mm-hmm.
and he ended up settling near San Diego. And then in October of 1984, he attacked Lori Burroughs. It was really brutal. He kidnapped her, beat her severely, and then strangled her.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. But remarkably, Burroughs survived.
Wow.
And then just a month later, the police found him in his car in the same area where that attack on Burroughs had happened. And he was with another unconscious woman who had also been beaten and strangled.
That is terrifying. I mean, to have 2 such violent attacks within such a short period of time, it's just incredible. So did he face any consequences for these crimes in California?
He did. So he ended up serving 2.5 years in prison for the kidnapping and attempted murder of Burroughs and the assault on the other woman. But when he was released in February of 1987, he moved to Los Angeles. And this is where authorities believe he committed at least 10 more murders. So the late 1980s in Los Angeles were a really deadly period.
It's just chilling to think that he could serve time for such violent crimes and then just continue on that path in a new location. How was he finally caught and convicted for murder?
So he was arrested in September 2012 at a homeless shelter in Kentucky on a narcotics charge.
Okay.
And he was extradited to California. And it was actually advances in DNA technology that finally provided that crucial link. So they were able to connect him to the murders of Linda Alford, Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca, and Audrey Nelson Everett, all of whom were killed in Los Angeles between 1987 and 1989.
So it took decades for the technology to catch up with the crimes that he had committed.
Exactly. So he was charged in January 2013, and the trial took place in September 2014 for those 3 murders. And the prosecution presented the DNA evidence that they found on the victims. And they also had testimony from several women who had survived attacks by him years earlier. And so he was actually found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
So a life sentence for 3 murders,
Yeah.
that in itself is obviously a, significant outcome. But as we know, that's not the end of the story.
Right.
This is when those confessions started coming out.
It is, and it's really remarkable. Starting in November 2018, Little started confessing to just a huge number of murders. And this reportedly started because he wanted to get transferred to a different prison.
Really?
Yeah. He
Wow.
wanted to get out of the Los Angeles County Jail.
Wow.
So just days after he made those initial admissions, he was charged in Texas with the 1994 murder of Denise Christie brothers. And he had actually confessed to that crime to a Texas Ranger earlier that year. And he ultimately pleaded guilty to her murder in December 2018 and received yet another life sentence.
So it's almost as if he, facing this reality of life in prison, he just decided to kind of unburden himself and reveal the true horrific scale of his actions.
That's a good way to put it.
And these confessions span such an incredible number of states,
Right.
really just reflecting his transient lifestyle.
It really does. And it's shocking to see, geographically, just how many murders he confessed to.
Right.
So in Alabama, he confessed to the 1979 murder of Brenda Alexander. And then in Georgia, he confessed to multiple killings. There was an unidentified woman in 1977, and then Fredonia Smith in 1982. Then in Louisiana, he admitted to the murders of Dorothy Richards in 1982 and Daisy McGuire in 1996.
Wow. And Mississippi was another state where he confessed to quite a few murders, right?
Absolutely. In Mississippi, he confessed to killing Julia Critchfield in 1978, Nancy Carol Stevens in 2005, and Alice Denise Taylor and Tracy Lynn Johnson in 1992. And it doesn't stop there. South Carolina, Florida, Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, It's just this pattern of violence across this massive area and over so many years.
Yeah. It's just a chilling reminder of how he was able to move around and avoid detection for so long. And Ohio, where he actually spent a good part of his childhood, also became a focal point of these confessions.
Definitely. In May 2019, he was indicted in Ohio for the murders of Mary Jo Payton in 1984 and Rose Evans in 1991. They were both killed in Cleveland, and both of them were strangled. Was a common thread in his crimes, and their bodies were both discarded. Rose Evans' body was found in 1991 in a vacant lot, and the coroner determined that she had been strangled. Mary Jo Payton's case is really interesting because she was actually unidentified for a long time.
Wow.
Yeah. And then in 1992, her thumbprint was matched in an FBI database.
Yeah.
And then Little confessed to meeting her at a bar. Yeah. It's crazy how these things come together, you know?
It is.
And then there's another woman in Cleveland who he admitted to killing. This was around 1977 or 1978. And her skeletal remains were actually found in Willoughby Hills, Ohio in 1983, but she's never been identified. It's believed that she was a young black woman.
So sad.
It is. And then he also confessed to the murders of 2 women in Cincinnati. One of them was identified as Anna Stewart, and her body was found in Grove City, Ohio. She was last seen in 1981. And then the other Cincinnati victim, she's only known as Jane Doe. She was a black woman who he killed sometime between 1980 and 1999. And he left her body near a cigarette billboard. So in June 2019, he was indicted in Hamilton County, Ohio for the murders of those 2 Cincinnati women.
I mean, it's just, with so many victims and so much time passing between the crimes and the confessions, it creates such a complex investigative challenge. And you mentioned earlier the victim portraits, right?
Right.
And how important those were to the case.
Yeah. Those portraits that he drew of a lot of the women he murdered were incredibly important. So the FBI decided to release those sketches to the public, hoping that someone would recognize one of the faces and could maybe provide a lead. And it actually worked. In at least one instance in Akron, Ohio, a portrait directly led to solving a cold case that had been open for decades. And then there's the case of Zena Marie Jones. He killed her in Memphis, Tennessee in 1990.
Right.
And her family had been searching for her ever since she disappeared in July of that year. And then in April of 2022, they recognized a resemblance between one of Little's sketches and Zena Marie. Her body had actually been found shortly after she disappeared on the Arkansas side of the Mississippi River, but she was unidentified until that recognition in 2022.
It's just an incredible example of the impact that those, disturbing drawings could have.
Yeah.
It brings some closure, to these families who've been wondering for decades.
It does.
So was there a typical profile for his victims? Was there like a pattern in who he targeted?
There was, and it's a disturbing one. The majority of his victims were sex workers, or people who struggled with substance abuse, or who were homeless. And most of them were women. And Little himself actually said that he targeted these individuals because he thought that their disappearances would be less likely to be noticed or investigated by law enforcement.
It's just heartbreaking to think that their marginalized status made them so vulnerable and, their case is less likely to be taken seriously. It speaks to such a profound societal failing.
It does. And it really forces us to confront these really uncomfortable truths about how certain segments of society can be overlooked and undervalued.
Yeah. It's a very difficult reality to face. So let's shift gears a little bit. We've talked about the overall scale of his crimes, the confessions. Let's talk about the 8 confirmed victims, the ones that actually led to convictions or a guilty plea. Can we go through those briefly?
Yeah, definitely. So we have Annie Lee Stewart. She was 32 years old and was murdered in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1981. He strangled her and left her body in the woods, and he was convicted of her murder in 2019. Then there's Mary Jo Payton. She was 21. Killed in Cleveland, Ohio around 1984 after she met Little at a bar. Her body was found in an abandoned factory. Again, he was convicted of her murder in 2019. Then there's Carol Linda Alford, who was 41 when she was murdered in Los Angeles in 1987. DNA evidence from her body directly linked Little to the crime, and that led to his conviction in 2014. Audrey Nelson Everett was 35. She was found in a dumpster in Los Angeles in 1989. She'd have been strangled. And again, DNA evidence linked Little. He was convicted in 2014. Then there's Guadalupe Apodaca, who was 46. She was found in an abandoned auto repair shop in Los Angeles in 1989. DNA evidence led to his conviction in 2014.
And then there's Zena Marie Jones, whose identification we talked about earlier, right?
Yeah.
The one who's identified through his sketch.
Exactly. Zena Marie Jones. She was 30 years old when she was murdered in West Memphis, Arkansas in 1990. Little confessed to her murder, and he provided that sketch that eventually led to her identification in 2022. He was found guilty of her homicide in 2019. Rose Evans, who was 32, was murdered in Cleveland, Ohio around 1991. Little offered her a ride and then strangled her, and he was convicted in 2019. And finally, Denise Christie Brothers. She was 32 years old when she was murdered in Odessa, Texas in 1994. Little confessed and pleaded guilty to her murder in 2018, and that was his 4th life sentence.
Wow. So 8 confirmed victims through convictions and a guilty plea.
Right.
But as we know, the number of confessed victims is so much higher. So can you give us just a little bit more of a sense of the scope by mentioning a few more, even if many of them remain unidentified?
Yeah, of course. So, there's Mary Jo Brosley, who was killed in Florida in 1970. Sarah Brown, murdered in New Orleans in 1973. Martha Cunningham, who was killed in Tennessee in 1974. Leanne Helms, murdered in Houston in 1977. Julia Critchfield in Mississippi in 1978. Brenda Alexander in Alabama in 1979. Linda Sue Boards in Kentucky in 1981. Dorothy Richard in Louisiana in 1982. And Melinda Lepre in Mississippi, also in 1982, which was the case that he was initially arrested for but not indicted. And then there was the unidentified black female whose skeletal remains were found in Cleveland in 1983. And, Little confessed to killing her several years prior, but unfortunately there wasn't enough information from her remains to identify her.
It's just a stark reminder of how many lives were lost
Yeah.
and how many families are probably still out there not knowing what happened to their loved ones.
Yeah.
So shifting gears a little bit, can we talk about his personal life? Did that offer any insights into his behavior?
So he had a long-term girlfriend named Aurelia Dorsey. They were together for many years. And she supported them, at least partly through shoplifting. They were together until she died in 1988. There's actually a record of a robbery case back in 1971 where information that Dorsey provided from jail actually helped his defense and led to his acquittal.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a strange twist. So Little himself actually died in 2020
Yeah,
while he was in custody in California.
he did.
And were there any details released about the cause of death?
He reportedly had a number of health problems, like diabetes and heart problems. But an official cause of death was never publicly released.
And of course, this case has gotten a lot of media attention.
It has, and a lot of that attention can be attributed to the work of Jillian Lauren.
Yeah.
She did some really in-depth interviews with Little while he was in prison, and her investigation turned into a book called Behold the Monster, Confronting America's Most Prolific Serial Killer and Uncovering the Women's Society Forgot. She was also very involved in the documentary series Confronting a Serial Killer, and her work has been really crucial in just raising awareness about the case and, more importantly, bringing attention to the victims.
Yeah. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you think are most important for our listeners to remember about Samuel Little?
I mean, the biggest thing is just the scale of it. It's unprecedented. To have one person responsible for so many deaths across so many states for so many decades without being caught, it's just incredibly disturbing. And, his conviction for just a small fraction of his confessed murders, and then this flood of confessions that followed, it just reveals a level of violence that's really hard to even grasp.
And it's so important that we remember the victims. So many of them were marginalized, and their disappearances might not have been given the attention they deserved at the time.
Absolutely. And the work that's being done to identify the rest of the victims, using his drawings and any other information that's out there, it's incredibly important work.
Yeah.
It's about bringing peace to their families and making sure that these women are not forgotten.
Yeah. This has been a tough one, but it's definitely been an important one.
Yeah.
So as a final thought for our listeners, consider those systemic factors that allowed these crimes to go unnoticed for so long. What does that say about us as a society? What does it say about our biases and how vulnerable certain populations are? And what does it mean that so many people could disappear for decades without a trace? That's a question that sticks with you long after you've examined the details of this case.
Definitely.
So thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.